Consciousness is at one and the same time the most familiar and the most mysterious feature of our lives. It's familiar to us because that's what our life consists in. I mean, we're in a state of consciousness from the time we wake up in the morning, throughout the day, until we go to sleep at night or otherwise become unconscious. But at the same time, it's mysterious because we've got a great deal of difficulty in trying to figure out how consciousness fits into the rest of the world, to the rest of the universe. Now, I've made a few suggestions about how we should think of consciousness to remove some of the mystery. We ought to think of consciousness as a biological phenomenon, as part of our biological existence, as an ordinary biological process in the brain. But still, even so construed, it's got a lot of special features. And in this talk, I'm going to discuss, not all, that would take all day, but I'm going to discuss what I think are the most interesting, salient features of consciousness. And let's just list them. I mean, the simplest way to do this is just go through a list. Well, number one, and this is the one that has made consciousness seem especially troubling to both philosophers and neurobiologists, is subjectivity, the qualitative feel of consciousness. The fact that my conscious states only exist as experienced by me, and your conscious states only exist as experienced by you, and in each case there's a certain qualitative subjectivity to the consciousness. The point that we made in earlier discussions to the effect that for every conscious state there's always a question, what's it like? Or what does it feel like? What does it feel like? What's it like to drink beer, listen to Beethoven, fall off a cliff, or go skiing in deep powder? We all recognize those as states of consciousness because we recognize that for each of those there is a qualitative feel to that state. There's no answer to the question, well, what's it feel like to be a brick? Or what's it feel like to be a shingle and have to sit on a roof all day long? Because we know it doesn't feel like anything because bricks and shingles are not conscious. So that's the special feature of consciousness that makes it hard to assimilate it. Even if we recognize, even if everybody agrees with me that we're talking about biology here, even if everybody agrees with that, there's still a problem. How do you account for that in neurophysiological terms? How do you get over the hump from neurobiology to feeling? And I will say something about that in subsequent lectures. What I want to concentrate now are the features of consciousness we need to explain, and the hardest feature to explain is this one, the subjectivity of consciousness. The second feature I think is absolutely amazing if you allow yourself to think about it, to be struck by it, and it's this. I don't just have individual states of conscious awareness, but rather I have them all united into a single stream of consciousness. So right now, for example, I don't just feel the shirt against my neck and the weight of my shoes and the sound of my voice and the sight of the assembled people and the taste of the water, but I have all of those as part of a single unified conscious experience. Now that's amazing if you think about it. I mean, how does the brain do it? How does the brain take in all of these diverse stimuli? It's bad enough to think how the brain has to convert those into a sensation of green or the taste of water, but how then does the brain put all of those together into a unified conscious state as part of a unified stream of ongoing consciousness in time? Kant, Immanuel Kant, who had his usual gift for catchy phrases, called this feature the transcendental unity of apperception, and he thought it was hard to account for it, and he tried to account for it on metaphysical grounds, but I see it as a problem in biology. It's a neat trick. How does the brain do it? Now, one of the ways we have of studying all of this stuff is to study the pathological cases, is to study the cases where there are breakdowns. And there are breakdowns in the unity of consciousness, and they tell us something about the nature of that unity. the unity of consciousness has both a horizontal and a vertical dimension. By those metaphors, I mean consciousness is unified in time, so at the beginning of the sentence, I have to remember by the time I get to the end of the sentence what happened at the beginning, or I can't have a coherent thought. That's the horizontal unity, but also I have to have all of the different components of my conscious states unified in any given slice of the temporal sequence. If you think of my consciousness as a big sausage moving through time, each slice has to be unified. And there are breakdowns in that unity. Some of the most fascinating cases are the split brain cases studied by Sperry and Mike Gazzaniga and others, but those are the two most famous names, where you have patients who suffered from terrible epilepsy. And the way they treated the epilepsy, I'm glad to say they don't do this operation anymore, but in some cases the way they treated the epilepsy was by cutting the two hemispheres apart. That is, the brain hemispheres are held together by a big chunk of tissue called a corpus callosum, and you do what's called a commissurotomy, where you cut the corpus callosum. Now, as I said, they don't allow that operation anymore. They cut part of it, but there were some patients where they cut the whole thing. So the two parts of the brain were separate from each other, and what you got were, I think, two independent loci of consciousness, two separate. This locus was not directly connected to that locus. So you would get curious experiments like the following. You hold up an object in such a way that is seen by the left eye, by the part that connects to the right brain. On the right brain, there is no language. Most people language on the left side. And you ask the patient, what do you see? And with his left brain, he says, I don't see anything. And then with his left hand, which is tied to his right brain, which can see the object, he reaches out and grabs it. So you have this straight inconsistency between the left brain, which is doing the talking and doesn't see anything, and the right brain, which sees in these particular experiments, but can't say anything about it. And there are lots of fascinating experiments where you get this inconsistency. We get a breakdown in the unity of consciousness, in the vertical unity. Breakdowns in the horizontal unity over time are also very common, where you get breakdowns in short-term memory. Some of the most tragic cases are cases of Korsakoff syndrome, where the patient's brain is so damaged that he is incapable of maintaining short-term memory, and you find a situation where the doctor introduces himself to the patient, and then if the doctor leaves the room and comes back, the patient won't recognize the doctor. The one patient, his memory is frozen in the 1950s when he was 19 years old, and now he's an elderly man, and he has memories that go up to 1953 but don't continue on after that. But in the more extreme case, and you do have other cases where the part of the brain that lays down long-term memory is removed, and in such cases the patient can't store any more long-term memories, and in those cases the patient really has a breakdown in the sequence, in the flow of conscious experience. But if you think in your own life, sometimes happened to me, I start a sentence and then I get into the sentence and a few clauses get attached, and they're kind of interesting to me, those clauses, so I begin to attach more relative clauses to the clauses I've already mentioned, and I continue along adding the odd conjunction here and there and put in a wherever and a however and a whereas and stick in more semicolons until finally I wonder, how the hell did I begin this sentence anyhow? I'm sure you're all familiar with this kind of stuff. So unless you can keep some sort of unity, both simultaneously and over time, both the vertical slice and the continuation through time, you get breakdowns in consciousness, and that unity ought to be fascinating to us, and I see it as a subject for an interesting neurobiological investigation, because it's not at all obvious how the brain can do that. Now, the third feature is the one that philosophers have concentrated on, I think, probably more than anything else, and that's this. It is a remarkable capacity of the mind, and in particular of the conscious mind, that is capable of directing its thoughts, feelings, and perceptions at objects and states of affairs in the world that are totally independent of the mind. I have mentioned that feature earlier. Philosophers call it intentionality. Intentionality is simply that feature of the mind by way of which it is directed at or about objects and states of affairs in the world. Now, not all conscious states are intentional, and not all intentional states are conscious. It's possible to have forms of depression and anxiety where you don't know what you're anxious about, or you don't know what you're depressed about, or elation, where you just feel good. Some of my students take chemicals that make them just have a feeling of well-being, but they don't feel good about anything. Those are the non-intentional cases. But for the intentional cases, there's an answer to the question, well, what is it that you're happy about, or what is it that you're depressed about? I gave a lecture on this subject once to an audience of psychoanalysts, and they got very excited and said, yes, that's our job. Our job is to convert the non-intentional cases of anxiety, where the patient is anxious but doesn't know what he's anxious about, into the intentional cases where the patient knows now what he's worried about or what he's anxious about. It reminded me of Freud saying, the aim of psychoanalysis is to replace neurotic misery with ordinary human unhappiness. And I guess it's characteristic of ordinary human unhappiness that you know what you're unhappy about. It is intentionalistic. So there are conscious forms of experience, such as anxiety and elation, and I think also pains and unpleasant feelings and so on, pleasant feelings in the body, where the painfulness and the pleasurableness is not itself intentional. There's no answer to the question, what is your pain about? It's just you have a pain. There are those cases of consciousness that lack intentionality, and of course there are cases of intentionality that aren't conscious. There are lots of beliefs and desires that I have that I'm not thinking about now. And I'm not just considering the Freudian cases where something is repressed and it's so painful you can't think about it, but just ordinary cases like falling asleep, where you still believe that so-and-so is president, even though you're not thinking about it at that particular moment in your sleep. So there is an overlap between consciousness and intentionality, because many but not all conscious states are intentional, and there are many but not all intentional states are conscious, but it's not coextensive. So I emphasize that because some philosophers have thought somehow it has to be coextensive. Consciousness has to be intentional, and intentionality has to be conscious. Now we're going to say more about intentionality later, but I want you to see that is the key notion by way of which the mind relates itself to the world, is by way of being able to think about, reflect on, perceive, and voluntarily and intentionally act on the world. All of those are cases where we stand in this intentional relation to the world around us, to the world that exists independently of our mental states. And one of the interesting questions that we need to answer is, what's the relationship between intentionality and consciousness exactly? Because since Freud, we have come to find it comfortable to think, well, there are all kinds of mental states that are unconscious, and those influence our behavior. But some people have now said, not only are there mental states that are unconscious that determine our behavior, but there's a whole inventory of unconscious intentional states that aren't even the kind of thing that could be conscious. They're so deeply in the unconscious you couldn't possibly bring them to consciousness. And of course you'll know what those states are. They're usually called computational states. That is, that a lot of people in cognitive science will say, I have these rules I'm following, but of course I can't think about the rules. I can't bring them to consciousness. They're not even the kind of thing you could bring to consciousness because they consist in purely abstract computational mechanisms, and those couldn't be conscious, though they're mental. And this is a question we'll need to answer. What's the relationship between consciousness and intentionality and the notion of the mental? I'm going to come back to that in a subsequent lecture. At this point, we're just doing a geography. We're doing a kind of examination of the terrain of consciousness, and we've discovered three features so far: subjectivity, unity, and intentionality. Now, a fourth feature I think may seem more controversial, but I think it's important, and that's this. Every conscious state comes with a certain sort of flavor to it, which I think is correctly described in English as a mood. We always have some mood in which we're experiencing our consciousness. It needn't be a mood that's got a name. I'm not, in a normal case, let's say when I'm driving to work, I'm not especially depressed, nor especially elated, nor especially exasperated or anxious, and I'm not even just blah. I'm just driving to work. But nonetheless, even when I'm driving to work, there is a certain flavor or tone to my conscious states, and you become aware of that when there's a dramatic shift. You're driving to work and you hear on the radio that war has just broken out, or they're going to raise taxes, or that your favorite team just lost, or whatever. Or you get to the office and you open a letter saying that your income tax is being audited by the Internal Revenue Service, or that you won the lottery, or whatever, and you will discover there's a dramatic shift in your mood. And mood is nowhere more obvious to you than when suddenly you get a dramatic shift. You feel lousy or you feel great, your mood shifts. And what that tells me is that it's characteristic of consciousness that it always comes in some mood or other. There's always some tone or flavor to consciousness, even in cases where that tone, flavor, or mood doesn't have a famous name like elation or depression or anxiety or enthusiasm or exuberance or exasperation. Moods are not to be confused with emotions. Moods will dispose you to having an emotion. Certain moods you're more likely to get angry than others, as we all know. But emotion is not the same as mood. Emotions, I think, always have to do with agitated forms of desire. Whenever you're in an emotional state, you have some sort of agitated desire. So emotions are fairly special. I am not always in some emotional state or other, but I think I am always in some mood or other. Now there's another feature to consciousness which, again, as always in philosophy, we've got to allow ourselves to be astounded by things that any sane person just takes for granted. We've got to allow ourselves to be struck by the obvious, and I think this is obvious. In the non-pathological cases, our conscious states don't just come to us as what William James described as a blooming, buzzing confusion. They are structured. There's a structure to our consciousness. And in fact, the brain is such a remarkable instrument that it will make a structure even when you have very unstructured and degenerate stimuli. Now, the people who were the best at studying this were the Gestalt psychologists, and I'm kind of sorry they gave up the field. They didn't really pursue it to the limit. But what they discovered was that you have a natural tendency to impose structure even when the stimulus you're getting has a very indefinite structure. So, for example, if you see a bunch of lines like this, you will immediately, how should I say, recognize that as a human face? Well, it doesn't actually look like a human face. But your brain, your perceptual apparatus will simply structure that as a human face. Now, if you saw somebody on the street that looked like that, you'd call an ambulance or you'd try to get a photograph because, of course, it doesn't actually look like a face. No human being in the history of the world ever looked like that. But, I mean, with huge gaps here and here and so on. But all the same, we all normally structure that as a human face, and that is what is true of this is true of perception in general. We're more sensitive to faces than most things, but we will structure very degenerate experiences as a car passing. All you saw was a flash, or as a chair when all you see is a corner sticking out from behind the table. So we have this ability to take our input stimuli, which may be very poorly representative of the structure that we construct, and then we construct this gestalt. We construct a form on the basis of the poor stimulus we get. It seems to me there are at least two aspects to the gestalt phenomena. One is the one I just mentioned, namely the making of forms, the making of structures even where the data presented are insufficient to determine the form. But also there is another structural aspect, and that is we see things as a figure against a ground, against a background. So I see this as my watch against my hand, and I see my hand against the background of the table, and the table against the background of the floor, until finally we reach the horizon, and I can't see anything more. So, and what's true of I pick visual examples because so much of our brain is devoted to vision, but I think what I've said about vision is true of other sensory modalities, is true of sound and touch as well, is that we structure the input data into meaningful forms, and we perceive the forms as forms against a background. Again, I think those are remarkable features of our consciousness. Well, another distinction, which is a source of some confusion in discussions of consciousness, is the distinction between the center and the periphery of our consciousness. The reason that this is a source of confusion is that sometimes we use words like consciousness or awareness to mean only what is at the center of our consciousness, and I'm not using it that way. Now again, let me illustrate this point. In any ordinary, non-pathological conscious experience, there are some things you're focusing your attention on, and other things that you're not paying any attention to, even though they're there. So there are items of furniture in this room that are at the periphery of my visual field, or things like the feeling of a shirt against my back and neck, or the feeling of the tightness of the shoes on my feet. They're part of my field of consciousness, but I'm not paying attention to them. I am paying attention to the problems of explaining certain philosophical points to an audience. But here, this is a remarkable feature. You can shift your attention at will. You can move your attention, and the metaphor of the searchlight is almost inevitable. You can move your attention like a searchlight from now this part of your conscious field to that part of the conscious field. It is characteristic of normal pathological consciousness that it comes to us with a clear distinction between what's at the center of our attention and what is on the periphery. And we can shift attention at will. It's a mistake, I think, or at least it's a source of confusion, to say, well, all that we're really conscious of is the stuff that's at the center of our consciousness. No, I am now conscious of the tightness of my shoes, or the feeling of the shirt on my skin, but it's not at the center of my attention. I'm not focusing my attention on it. William James, as usual, was very good here, but he makes exactly the shift that I want to argue against. He says, consciousness goes away from where it's not needed. Now, what I think he meant was attention goes away from where it's not needed. So when I first put on my shoes, I'm very aware, very attentive to how tight they are. But once I got them on and I'm going around the day, I never give it a thought. I can focus my attention. Right now, my right shoe's tighter than my left shoe. But that's not the sort of thing I need to focus my attention on, so I don't. Attention naturally goes to where it's needed and does not distribute itself evenly between center and periphery. Now there is another distinction, and this I think we're getting up to about our seventh feature of consciousness, and that's this. In addition to the center and the periphery of consciousness, it seems to me all of our conscious states come with a kind of sense of their situatedness, even though the situatedness of consciousness is not an object of consciousness. It's not part of the field of consciousness. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in general, when I'm conscious, I am aware of what time of day it is, what part of the country I'm in, what month of the year it's in, what citizen, what country I am a citizen of. Now, again, one of the indications of these things, one thing that will tell you what's going on is when you get breakdowns. And there is a peculiar form of vertigo that if you haven't had it, it will occur to you when you get older, where you have these feelings, what month is this anyway? Are we still in May? Or I sometimes have, now wait a minute, which semester are we in? Are we in the fall? I mean, that's really bad. Which semester? Are we in the fall semester or the spring semester? And those are breakdowns in what I call the boundary conditions. So conscious states typically come to us with a sense of their situatedness in space and time, but these are not part of the object of consciousness. It isn't part of what we're thinking of. It's distinct from both center and periphery. It's the sense of the locatedness of both the center and the periphery. Where am I? Who am I? What am I? Where is this? And where are we in time? All of those, I think, are part of the sense of the situatedness or the boundary conditions on our conscious experiences. Now, another feature that I think is really not the same as any of the ones that I have mentioned so far, but it's related to them, is this. Normal pathological conscious states come to us under what I would call an aspect of familiarity. That is to say, even if I am in a group of strangers, I recognize these people as people. I recognize these things they have on as clothing. And even if I'm in a very strange environment, I'm in the jungles of Middle America, all the same, even in the jungle village, these are still dwellings, these huts. That's still the sky. These are still plants. That is to say, we naturally tend to perceive our immediate environment when conscious under categories that are familiar to us. We naturally tend to perceive things using familiar categories, and to that extent, all of our normal non-pathological consciousness comes to us under the aspect of familiarity. It's hard to break that. You see, the surrealist painters tried hard to do it. They wanted to break our sense of familiarity. But even in the surrealist painting, the three-headed woman is still a woman. She's got three heads, but she's still a woman. And the drooping watch is still a watch. And even if you've got a surrealist painting where you can't recognize any of the objects, still, that's the sky and that's the horizon. It takes a conscious effort, a serious effort, to try to break the feeling of familiarity, or what I prefer to call the aspect of familiarity. Now, there is, in fact, a logical argument, I think, why that has to be, and it goes back to the point I made about intentionality. If consciousness is typically intentional, and we represent objects and states of affairs to our mind, then, since all representation is under an aspect, we can only have intentionality under an aspect. But then the aspect requires categories. I see that as a person, that as a woman, that as a tree, this as a duck, that as a rabbit. In order to see things as people, ducks, rabbits, trees, houses, etc., I have to have those categories, and those categories give me the possibility of familiar experiences because I'm imposing the familiar categories on the structure of my experience. So the feeling of familiarity, I think, is a consequence of intentionality if we understand the structure of intentionality. Now, another feature that I am struck by is this. It seems to me, again, that it's characteristic of ordinary, non-pathological conscious states that they always refer beyond their manifest content. They always refer beyond themselves. So the extreme case of this are where you have a sudden thought which occurs to you in a fraction of a second, where it would take you several minutes to explain the actual content of that thought, because the thought refers beyond. Now, construct stories and you can think of this. Imagine that Sally is having a conversation with Jimmy in an espresso shop as they sip their cappuccinos, and she says, "That's it." And we ask her after, well, what did you mean when you said, "That's it"? And she says, well, at that point, it suddenly occurred to me. And then she goes on. For the past 18 months, I had been wasting my life in a relationship that could not possibly succeed because whereas I am a graduate student in comparative literature, Jimmy is the leader of the Oakland, California branch of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, and the disparity in our modes of sensibility is such as to make a continuation of this relationship unlikely and extreme. And then she goes on and on and on. Now, that's typical. You see, I took an extreme case because that's an extreme case where in a tiny fraction of a second, you have this huge overflow. But I think ordinary experiences have an overflow. So I don't just see a clock or somebody's running shoes or a chair, but I see a clock that reminds me of a clock I once had when I lived in Denver, Colorado, and that sets off a further chain of thoughts and associations. It's generally the case, I want to suggest, that with consciousness, there is an overflow. Consciousness is always overflowing its boundaries and making reference to things that are beyond the immediate content of consciousness. Well, I could continue indefinitely with this list, but let me round it off with one more dimension. And that's this. In addition to mood, boundary, center, situatedness, gestalt, intentionality, and so on, it seems to me important to point out that all of our conscious experiences come to us under the aspect of, roughly speaking, pleasure or unpleasure. There's always the question, whenever you're reporting on a conscious experience, did you have fun or not? Was it pleasant, unpleasant, amusing, boring, exasperating, ecstatic, irritating, frustrating? There's a vast vocabulary for describing the different dimensions of what's pleasant and unpleasant. But I don't think, and this is obviously some evolutionary advantage to this, we seek the pleasant conscious states and try to avoid the unpleasant conscious states. But I think it is characteristic of any conscious state that it comes to us under the aspect of pleasure and unpleasure. Was it fun or not? Did you have a good time or not? All of those are appropriate questions when you're reporting any conscious state. Well, if you're familiar with the history of philosophy, you'll see that I left out some of the most famous war horses in the discussion of consciousness. I've been trying to come at this as innocently as I could and just sit down and try to figure out what's characteristic of my conscious states when I'm in a non-pathological state. I'm not drunk or falling asleep. I haven't been hit on the head, and just try to describe those. Now, you can often, as I said, get at those by examining the pathological cases, by looking at the Korsakoff syndrome cases, or the case I mentioned where the man has had his hippocampus removed and he can't lay down long-term memories. But if you look at the philosophical tradition, again, going back to Descartes and even earlier, what you find is there are a lot of things attributed to consciousness that seem to me mistaken. People will say things about consciousness, and they'll say it's essential to consciousness that it has such and such features, and I don't think they're right about that. And I want to conclude this part of the discussion by mentioning the three things that are most commonly attributed to consciousness, all in the tradition that goes from Descartes to Kant, which seem to me mistaken. It is typically said, Kant said this explicitly, all consciousness is self-consciousness. It sounds better in German. Bewusstsein ist Selbstbewusstsein. It's hard to make it sound that good in English. And forgive me for my German mispronunciation. But Kant was convinced of that, and a lot of other philosophers, many of whom I respect, are convinced of that. That seems to me wrong. I am not always self-conscious. Self-consciousness seems to me a rather sophisticated state where you're aware not only of seeing your watch, but you're aware of yourself being aware of seeing your watch. You have this kind of second-order self-consciousness, or you're aware of yourself as a self being conscious. And I don't believe that that is typical of all conscious states. There are states in which one is not just conscious, but one is self-conscious. I'm in a restaurant eating a steak. In a normal case, I just eat the steak and drink the wine. But there are moments when suddenly it all seems too much. And you think, here I am. I'm eating this steak. I'm drinking this wine. It's all de trop. I mean, it's all just too much. Now that, I agree, that is a state of self-consciousness and not just consciousness. But that's pretty sophisticated. I don't think my dog has those kinds of states very often, where he's not just conscious of eating, but conscious of himself as an eater, as a gustatory pleasure taker. And that seems to me requires a level of sophistication, which is probably only common to animals that have language or something like a language. If I go into a restaurant and I'm eating the steak and I notice everybody staring at me and I suddenly realize, oh, God, it's one of those days I forgot to put my pants on, then it's true. I become acutely self-conscious. But I have to say, those states are unusual. That kind of thing does not happen to me very often. So I am rejecting the traditional doctrine, traditional in our philosophical tradition, of saying that all conscious states are self-conscious, that you can't have a state of consciousness without a second-order state about your conscious state or a state about yourself being in that conscious state. Another common mistake is the idea that all of our knowledge of our conscious states is arrived at by a very special faculty we have, the faculty of introspection. And on the faculty of introspection, the way you know about consciousness is you spect intro. That is, you, so to speak, turn the eyeball around so that it is an inner eye, and you look at your conscious field with the inner eye. Very hard for us to think about knowledge except with the metaphor of vision. So it's not surprising that introspection is sort of an inspection intro. And that again seems to me wrong. I think there is a perfectly ordinary sense of introspection in which it's possible for me to introspect. Who do I want to vote for in the next election? Well, I can think about it, and I introspect my feelings and so on. But in this special philosophers and psychologists sense whereby there's a special capacity which is like vision, where I turn my attention inward and inspect the contents of my own mind by a kind of visual faculty, but it's a faculty which is for an inner vision, that seems to me wrong. And it seems to me there's a deep reason why it has to be wrong. Here's the reason. To make sense of the notion of vision, you have to have the features that I drew on the blackboard in an earlier lecture, between the perceiver and the act of perception and the object perceived, between me, the experience of seeing, and the cup that I see. But where introspection is concerned, if I introspect my pain, then there isn't any difference between my feeling the pain and my introspecting the pain. I can't make the distinction that I make for genuine cases of vision between the object I perceive and the act of perceiving it. But where the contents of my own mind are concerned, the act of perceiving and the object perceived are one and the same because they're both conscious states. I can't make the distinction between the experience of the conscious state and the act of perceiving the conscious state, because the act of perceiving is just the act of experiencing that conscious state. So the structural constraints on perception, on vision, make it impossible that there should be something analogous to vision by which we stand in a special relation to our own conscious states. And for that reason, I want to say I don't believe that there is some special faculty that we have for knowing our own conscious states, and that special faculty is like vision. Now, there's a third mistake common to our philosophical tradition, and that is the mistake of supposing that where my own conscious states are concerned, I have immediate and incorrigible certain knowledge. I can't be mistaken about the contents of my own mental states. And this actually is stated explicitly by Descartes. Descartes thought we had, as I mentioned before, the certainty of the cogito, the certainty of the I think, therefore I exist, where our own conscious states are concerned, because we have this immediate access to our own conscious states. But it seems to me there's nothing is more common than people misdescribing their own conscious states. They say they're in love when it turns out they're not in love, or they say they're not jealous when it turns out they are jealous. That often we're in a poor position to describe our own feelings and emotions, especially. The point is this: there is a distinction between the kind of knowledge I can have of an external object like this cup and the kind of knowledge that I have of my own thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And the distinction is that the way in which I distinguish the appearance that I have of the cup and the cup itself is different from the way I have of making a distinction between how my emotions seem to me and how they really are. I can't make the radical break between reality and appearance for the contents of my own mind that I can make for the real world. Why? Well, in the case of the contents of my own mind, they consist in a sequence of experiences, of appearances. But it doesn't follow from that that I can't be mistaken. There are a number of reasons why people make mistakes about their own conscious states. One is just simply inattention. I mean, they're just not paying close attention. But another one is self-deception. It often happens to us that we don't want to admit that we were jealous or angry, or that we are jealous or angry on a particular occasion when we in fact are. That seems to me very common. And in addition to inattentiveness and self-deception, there is a kind of ambiguity to many of our conscious states. It isn't that they have a determinate structure. Was it really a case of your being ambition, or was it just you were being ambitious, or was it just a case where you had a momentary desire to advance yourself? And often there is no definite answer to those cases. So I think it's a mistake to suppose that all consciousness is known to us incorrigibly, known to us with absolute certainty. We make all kinds of mistakes. The interesting truth that underlies the falsehood that we have, the certainty of the cogito, the certainty of the knowledge of our own intentional states, the truth that underlies that is the way we're mistaken about the contents of our own minds is a different kind of mistake from the mistake we make where we have hallucinations of a cup or we see something with optical illusions. All right, then, in this lecture, I have been concerned to do a kind of logical geography of consciousness, to just elucidate some of the central features of consciousness and try to eliminate some of the standard mistakes about consciousness. And I do that with an ulterior motive, which will emerge in later lectures. I want to pave the way for a science of consciousness, and I want to pave the way for a deeper understanding of the relationship between the consciousness and the unconscious.